uh, our principal to get ready. So we'll be streaming this live, and participants can join. And if we reach around 40 or 50 participants, then we can start the seminar. Webinar. All right. Thank you.
Kain sumri. Ke Very good evening, all of you, and welcome to HATIM College online webinar series for 3 consecutive nights, every evening from 7:30 to 9:30, on the theme Conversations on Zoe Identity. And I am your host for tonight. My name is Bilal Liangura from the Department of Philosophy. And I'm delighted, first of all, that we have managed to attract more than 200 registrants for this webinar. And I'm very proud of our collective team effort. And also, I'm also proud to our resource persons who have kindly consented to come and present their thoughts on this theme. And tonight, to begin with, I would like to invite our respected principal of HATIM College, Sar Sangtea, to make a few opening remarks and welcome remarks. Sar Sangtea, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings to you all from the Higher and Technical Institute, Mizoram. I'm afraid that I would speak too fast. When I reflect on the webinars that we have gone through these days especially, I have realized that I have been speaking too fast, and I'm trying to slow down my speech, and I hope you all will be able to catch up with me. Our topic this time raises the question of what a tribe is, I think. And let me try to assert this way as to what a tribe is. It could be seen in the context of contemporary situation of people who feel they belong together as an expression of shared identity rather than the traditional understanding of people with shared ancestry and shared culture and shared beliefs and history. Using a modern interpretation, tribes may be what people want them to be, and they may consist of uh, the tribes consist of people who create and maintain a strong enough identity to justify their claim. The starting point is the creation of a national identity. So this Zo identity is a very important topic to discuss upon. For instance, Scotland is divided by historical alignments, religions, language, east and west, highland and lowland, and belonging to the tribe-like clans. In fact, Scotland is a nation whose present identity has been created over the last 2 centuries. We may also suggest and include groups like football team supporters, music fans, and people who follow particular clothing fashion and styles. So this webinar sets out to examine this topic in a very serious manner. Now, on behalf of the departments of English and the Department of Philosophy of HATIM, I'd like to extend my profound greetings and warm welcome to all our resource persons, very distinguished resource persons we have here, the introduction of whom we will be hearing later on. And all the attendees, I'd like to welcome all of you to this thought-provoking webinar, and allow me to urge you to stay till the end and drop relevant queries and questions. So I wish you all a very interesting and beneficial webinar with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarsangtea. Thank you, Sarsangtea. That's our principal from HATIM College. Thank you very much for joining us and for gracing us on this occasion. So before we go further, let me say something about our series. Tonight, the lecture will be given by a dear friend of mine, a very distinguished scholar, Dr. Samuel G. Ngaite, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy in Manipur University. So he will talk on the topic, the conceptual challenge and responsibility of locating Zo discourses. Before I go on introducing him, let me just read out two other speakers that we will have tomorrow night and the night after. Tomorrow, we will have Sir Sizo Nunmoya from the Department of Political Science, St. Xavier's College, Lengpui. He will speak to us on the topic Nationalism, Culture and Politics, Reimagining Chin, Kuki, Mizo Identity in South Asia. So very, very interesting topic. So please stay on for tomorrow as well. And for the final night, we will have Professor Lalrin Diki Fanai, PR Diki Fanai, who is professor from the Department of English, Mizoram University, a very distinguished scholar in language linguistics. And she will speak on her area of expertise, a brief linguistic characteristics of Zo language and analysis from Mizo. So please stay on for tomorrow and the night after as well. So let me introduce Professor Samuel, Dr. Samuel Ngaite, in this way. This is his own words, so he cannot blame me. Dr. Samuel Ngaite is currently a faculty member of Department of Philosophy, Manipur University. He has completed his PhD in Comparative Hermeneutic Philosophy from Oxford Center for Mission Studies under the supervision of the very well-known and legendary Professor Gavin Flood, who is really a legend in the field of Hindu religious studies of Oxford University. His areas of research interest includes phenomenology and hermeneutics, Indology, comparative philosophy, philosophical anthropology, Religion and Ritual Studies, Dialogical Research, and Northeast Studies, which is among his key concerns. And he has a series of publications and papers and articles, but primarily, let me highlight this book that he's written. Sam, this is your thesis, right? This is a publication of your thesis, right? Yeah. His thesis, his doctoral thesis at Oxford is published as Vedic Practice, Ritual Studies, and Jaimini's Mimamsa Sutras, Dharma and the Enjoined Subject by Rutledge in 2019. So Sam and I go a long way back. There's a lot of water under the bridge between us. Personally, spiritually, intellectually, we have known each other and co-traveled together in a common journey for a long time. But that tonight is not a space and platform to reveal all that secrets. So without further ado, let me invite Professor Samuel G. Ngaite for his talk, The Conceptual Challenge and Responsibility of Locating Zou Discourses. Sam, over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Umura. Good evening, everyone. Greetings from Lamka. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Thank you first to Pusangkia and the panelists for the kind welcome. And thank you, Umura, for that very generous introduction. I need to already make a clarification. I'm not a professor by any means. I'm just a faculty member of Manipur University. And I don't have a series of publications yet, but I did publish my thesis as soon as I finished my PhD. But thank you for your kind introduction. It's always good to connect again. I would also like to thank HATIM College, Higher and Technical Institute, Mizoram, for allowing me the honor of kickstarting this 3-day webinar on a topic which is as important as conversations on Zou identity. And you know, when the poster first came out and I shared it in some WhatsApp groups of close friends and associates, the first reaction I got was, oh God, not another talk on Zou, not another webinar. As if to suggest that the topic has been attempted and explored enough, and that there is nothing new to say about Zou, especially one that would change people's allegiance or even accepted interpretations. The close association that any discussions on Zou have for how practical politics is sometimes shaped often means that people assume you have an ideological interest in talking about a particular theme or even in using a particular terminology. I would like to assure everyone that this talk is much more boring in that regard, although I accept the presupposition that our talks or our conversations, our way of thinking is an important foundation of how we govern our lives and choices. As a footnote, I would like to admit that I was initially very hesitant to participate in a conversation about Zou, especially with so many distinguished participants. And not only because they are far more brilliant scholars, actual professors, associate professors, and maybe even elders who know the subject matter like the back of their hand, but also because my own area of specialization, as Umura pointed out, is in the Indic traditions, a tradition that seems so far removed from our own. So I hope you will allow me a posture of learning rather than teaching or sharing or giving a talk that I would wish to assume in the course of this talk. And I hope we will be able to learn together from one another in spite of our blind sides. It is my belief that the path of knowing our own traditions, our Zou tradition, our own selves, is often through the detour of knowing and understanding the other. And that is why I was so interested, in a sense, in Indian traditions as well. I was informed by Umura that this webinar is entitled A Conversation precisely because it is only going to be a conversation starter for the possibility of a much more elaborate and exhaustive seminar that I think they will be organizing, the college will be organizing in the months to come. So I intend to stay true to that spirit, and therefore, rather than provide an exhaustive analysis on a particular thematic or a topic, I wish to present some very general concerns about the nature of those scholarship that I believe are important to engage in our contemporary context, and try and see if there's a way we can relate that with the question of Zoe identity. Now, although I have entitled my topic, The Conceptual Challenge and Responsibility of Locating Zoe Discourses, I realized it would make more sense if I rephrase it as the conceptual challenge of locating Zoe discourses and the responsibility of writing, which I hope will attempt to address two main concerns, which is about Zoe discourse and also the Zoe scholar. So I apologize for not having PowerPoints for you, for the listeners, and for the participants. I know that you would have a PowerPoint would have made our interaction much easier. I just never thought about it until Umura asked me if I had any slides. And so my approach will be much more boring and more simple. I'm just trying to attempt to deconstruct my own suggested topic in light of my own readings and experiences, and hopefully end that or conclude that with the goal of introducing a conversation about what I would like to call Zoe studies. Of course, this is not part of my title, but I am attempting to also talk about the idea of a Zoe studies. I would like to begin by clarifying what I mean by locating Zoe discourses. By locating or location, I simply mean the identification or the placing of a written academic work within a tradition of scholarship, which may be constituted by a debate, a discourse, or a study. So the task of locating is basically to identify the discourse or the debates to which a work is taken to be contributing. It must be noted that this is different from identifying the disciplines under which a work is listed. While the identification through disciplines is an easier route, the identification through the participation in a debate is more informative about any written work, as a debate is not always constrained within the boundaries of a particular discipline. Therefore, the question of locating or location is closely related to the question of identifying the argument or perspective that is being furthered, that is being developed, the specific way in which a contribution to knowledge is being pursued. Now, this is not to claim that this is to claim that there is no scholarship in a vacuum, that there is no written work that is not related to some other work, and that there is no work that is not part of a discourse. While it is possible that the limitations of academic genres may mean that there is a difficulty in locating a particular style of writing, and there are many examples there, but there is no such scholarship on those as yet that these academic genres should not be able to encompass. So the first question that I would like us to keep in mind as we go forward is, what are we writing about, and who are our conversation partners? Who is the other that we seek to address in our conversations on Zoe identity? Now, going to the other phrase, the phrase Zoe discourses, which for most of you will already have been, if not problematic, a very curious phrase. It could, according to me, be understood in two senses. Zoe discourse could be understood in the first sense as a discourse about Zoe as a subject matter. And secondly, it could be understood as discourses by Zoes on a variety of topics across disciplines. Now, the first sense, where Zoe is taken as a subject matter, gives rise to a range of interrogations, such as the common study of Zoe as a nomenclature that is self-ascribed by the people group residing in the northern Arakan Hills, Chi Hills, in Mizoram, in parts of Manipur, South Manipur, parts of Tripura, etc., and so on. And so the first one is the common study of Zoe as a nomenclature. The second is the category Zoe can also be taken as commonly presupposed, as a commonly presupposed meta-terminology that is not explicitly stated, but that is assumed when one talks about the people categorized by the colonial records under the Chin, Kuki, Lusai, or now Mizo fold. So studies on any aspects of the Chin, Kuki, Mizo world, and I would like to add Zomi here as well, would be treated as a study on the Zoe. In this sense, Zoe is not restricted to a nomenclature that is representative of a people group, but is treated as an overarching concept from a nomenclature to a concept that encompasses any research on the diverse zoo world or the diverse zoo tradition. Of course, there are other ways in which the category zoo is also pursued, such as the notion of zoo as a myth, a folktale, or even a progenitor that allows the narrating and imagining of a similar origin story. Or there are the more practical uses of zoo as a suffix or prefix that serves often as a political tool to articulate a political imagination. And dare I say, even clan vested or state vested interest, and so on. So you could add many more to the list. But the main point I want to highlight is that the understanding of zoo as a category or concept that we are talking about is a concept that encompasses the Chin Kuki Mizo world or tradition in all its mystery and complications. The second sense that we mentioned, where zoo is accepted as an unchallenged and given identification to indicate the people groups that are categorized by colonial records as Chin Kuki Lusai again, talks about the research done by zoos on a range of topics that are not necessarily limited to the zoo world. So here we can have a zoo scholar who is studying, for example, like me, the Indian traditions, for example. But our use and interest here for this talk is primarily on those studies that involve the zoo world in some capacity, that involves studies of the zoo world in some capacity, and not studies outside this world, even if carried out by zoo scholars. Therefore, by zoo discourse, I mean those discourse that treat zoo as a subject matter in the first sense, and is one that is not limited to zoo scholars, but includes anyone who specializes on any aspects of the zoo world. For example, in Manipur, we have Meitei professors who are doing a Paite language or Paite syntax, for example. And so we can add so many other examples of people who are non-zoos but are studying the zoo customs or its language or its rituals. So in this sense, zoo discourse may even be traced as the invention or inception of early travelers, such as the Chinese historians or even the Italian missionaries, and of course the colonial ethnographers and administrative officers. They were the first to write about us and our world. Now, having clarified these two uses of location and zoo discourse, we move on to our interest in locating such discourses. That is, locating the tradition of scholarship to which these written works contribute. And it is here that most emerging scholars of zoo or people who are interested in the study of zoo starts to face several problems, especially when they seek to map existing literatures on zoo. However, before we go into that, let us first look back at the kinds of research or work that was being carried out in what I loosely call early zoo scholarship, and especially look at the nature of some of the challenges that they faced. To study a people group as diverse as the zoos and a terrain as vast as what was once called the zoo country, a wide-ranging study of colonial records of the Indian, Burmese, and British archives is necessary. For many scholars, such comprehensive archival access was simply impossible. For those outside India, access to archives in most areas of Northeast was impossible because of the presence of the inner line permit then. While for those from the Northeast, Burmese and British archives were not accessible because of visa issues or even because of lack of opportunities to study or even go abroad. What this created was an over-reliance on secondary resources, something that Bianca has mentioned, almost all of which were written to further a particular standpoint and or interest, and therefore, in a sense, were inadequate. Now, these secondary resources, especially those written by colonial officers, were primarily concerned with information of military relevance, and they acted as officers committed to the expansion of empire, first and foremost, before they were anthropologists or even ethnographers. So most of the information available on zoos were largely based on historical knowledge provided by the colonial records. Many continue to rely heavily on these accounts to supplement their work. And here we are talking about zoo scholars. Texts such as Robert Reed's The Lusai Hills on the Frontier Areas Bordering Assam, or the popular Thomas Lewin's A Fly on the Wheel, How I Helped Govern India, and many other such accounts have been standard readings for any study on the zoos. In a way, we have all been implicitly raised in the colonial school of thought, if I might call it that, in our pursuit to write about our own selves and our world. This was not helped by the inability by scholars to theorize their oral practices and traditions early on. They had not had the right exposure to be able to articulate their critical reflections in a way that is both rigorous and insightful. They were not trained to employ standard methods of academic writing, which meant that the sources of their assertions were often very difficult to determine. And comprehensive ethnographies by those scholars in most areas, even till today, are non-existent. The story of the Zoos continued to be told predominantly from the perspective of the British or from the perspective of the nation states such as India and Burma, and very rarely on its own terms, on Zoo's own terms. The writing of Zoo history that was initiated was already comparatively late, as it was only in the subsequent years after the conversion to Christianity that such attempts were introduced. While most of the scholarship that were introduced, written by theologians and sometimes even politicians who sought to produce very specific narratives, the richness and intricacies of the Zoo tradition, what I call the Zoo spirit world in my other work, gets completely sidelined. Most studies on Zoo in time developed works that were narrow in their focus and interest. Bianca argues that besides Wumson's celebrated work on Zoo history, and maybe even T. Gauguin's Zomi history, there is not many that write about zoos in a comprehensive manner. And even these works that we have just mentioned are not the works of an academic, but are written by self-taught historians and politicians, writing with very particular goals, especially both of the ones we've mentioned, were writing to stop the infighting between the zoos and hopefully trying to spark a reunification consciousness and movement across all zoo territories. So in a sense, when we look at early zoo scholarship, some of the challenges that they face include the scarcity of primary resources that made them rely on secondary resources, the ability to theorize the orality of zoo tradition or the richness of the orality of zoo tradition. The question of academic rigor and academic writing was a concern. And then there were, of course, competing narratives and even political agendas that told a different story about what the zoo is and how we can use it. And then, of course, the adopting of a borrowed method whose epistemological stance is basically borrowed from colonial school of thought, as we mentioned, and so on and so forth. And you can add many to this list again. Today, it is easy to say that there are zoo scholars across a number of disciplines doing work on a number of topics, unhindered by the challenges that their predecessors faced, or at least facing them comparatively to a lesser extent. From research on identities from a historical perspective, to the study on marriages and kinship relations in sociology, for example, or insurgencies in political science, or even mission movements in theology, we have a number of scholarship on zoo topics from a range of perspectives, often influenced by the discipline under which the scholar is trained. Now, while this increase in research scholars and disciplinary exposure have resulted in the increase in the number of new resources that are being produced, however, this increase in scholarship has not always led to an increase in expansion of our perspectives about how to interrogate the zoo world, or indeed the possibility of forming a zoo worldview or a zoo way of seeing. So while new resources multiplied, the narrowing of how to talk about how to interrogate the zoo world was not really explored. This may be because of the common and continued practice of adopting the methodologies of our respective disciplines, which often has the tendency of propagating or even reaffirming reductionist perspectives. For example, if you scan through a few of the reading lists that you have by zoo scholars, you would be very hard-pressed to find scholars who critically engage terminologies such as insurgency, terminologies such as identity, culture, tribe, etc., and question the fundamental presuppositions and postulates of using these terminologies. Most contemporary scholars, in my limited experience, are happy to be a voice within their respective disciplines, not by offering new theoretical frameworks or indeed challenging the boundaries and constraints of their respective disciplines, but by offering new data. So the relevance of existing methodologies were not engaged or interrogated, but were often imposed upon the object of research as if to affirm their utility. Now, I'm not saying this is the case everywhere, but in my limited experience, this is often the case with the resources that I came in contact with. So the fundamental position and location of most scholars tended to be the same universalizing objectivist stance or position that was utilized by the colonial ethnographers and even other non-Zhou scholars. Therefore, to write was to produce new data, and these data were used to contribute to the notion of the voice from the margins, which is a supposition of the same linear historical development of scholarship that assumes that since the tribals are now more civilized, since they are changed by education and modernity, and they are now more well-trained and having more opportunities, they can be part of the discourse as marginal contributors finally. They are now part of the group. The tribals from the margins have made it. And this welcoming of voices from the margins in this way presupposes and continues a very Hegelian philosophy of an evolutionary historical development. It may be a presumptuous and maybe unwise claim to make on my part, but I believe that contemporary scholars are writing neither as social scientists nor as Zhous. They are writing neither as social scientists because they are not engaging with the foundational presuppositions of their disciplines and the methods and methodologies that come with them. And they are not writing as Zhous because they are unable and uninterested to assume the critical posture and approach that often enables a reflexive analysis and understanding of our own self. And so scholarship was used as a medium to disclose unknown worlds and unheard people groups, but not much attention was paid to the architecture of scholarship and the standards of participating in the world of discourse making. So in a sense, like new converts, we were interested in translating the Bible, but we were not really interested in hermeneutics, which makes translation possible. We were not interested in hermeneutics either as a philosophical tradition or as a methodological stance, even though that was the tradition that was developed to interrogate the issues of exegesis and translations. But we were very interested in translating the Bible. And so there is a gap there somewhere. This was accompanied by an absence of a critical inter-engagement amongst those scholars. And I don't know if I am right in making this claim, but apart from citing one another's work, I cannot often recall any collective critical engagement together of those scholars on their respective positions. There are seminars, there are webinars, there are many edited volumes where a variety of those scholars are brought together, but there are hardly any discussions in any of these literary forms on the question of method. This lack of engagement between themselves, that is, scholars working under the same thematic, combined with their lack of interest in the theoretical foundations of their disciplines, means that the work of the Zhous continue to remain isolated, like we said, from into the margins or from the margins, unable to capture the interest and curiosity of the academia at large. And it takes very good scholars to be able to hold the attention of the larger academia at large. For example, I can think of Professor Lal Sankima, who is an authority on contextual theology, for example. He is writing on, he is using the Mizo story as a data, but he is also talking about contextual theology that is relevant to Christianity. So in many cases, we have giants who we can look up to, but there are not many. And at least amongst contemporary scholars, there are not many that we can refer to as giants in their field. So all those studies, research, and findings increase with a number of theses now being submitted across universities, focusing on various aspects of the Zhou world. There is no increased interest in developing a conceptual framework that may be able to tie all of their interests together. So there are many Zhou scholars, but their interests are not tied together through a conceptual framework. There is no attempt to develop a scholastic tradition, if I may use such a grand phrase, and everyone continue to write individually rather than as scholars working on a similar subject matter. Again, like I said, I may be wrong in my presupposition, and please do correct me if I'm wrong. more scholars were locatable as those by their names, but not by their content or ideas or perspectives. There was nothing distinctive about Zoe scholarship. The question of identity as a reference to Zoe scholarship particularly was very notable by its absence. So while scholars were happy to operate within their respective disciplines, that choice did not often translate into producing economists, political scientists, or philosophers in their own right either. And so even those scholars who dismissed the idea of seeking a Zoe perspective as unjustified were also not producing scholarship on other topics at an international level, for example. So our methodologies, even our perspectives, are borrowed across disciplines. And the culture of seeking depth and understanding is not something that is as yet, I feel, commonly practiced. All scholars know that every discipline is founded on some thoughts or ideas. There are always some foundational thoughts or ideas on which a discipline is founded, and whose presuppositions are contextually being challenged through the years. And this is one of the features that allow any scholarship to persist over the years. In that light, how are our narratives, our studies, our findings about the Zoe tradition, and our insights contributing to this debate and tussle for finding new ways of knowing and living? It is this question that I believe directly relates to our discussion so far. It is this question that I believe directly relates our discussion so far to the question about Zoe identity, precisely because the underlying question that we want to ask ourselves as scholars belonging to the Zoe community looks something like this. What does it mean for a Zoe to write? Or what does it mean to write as a Zoe? This is a question which I want to focus now in light of our second concern. That is the responsibility of writing. Can we use our location or positionality as a Zoe as the basis upon which we engage and contribute conceptually? What then is distinctive about our location as Zoes? This is not a question about whether a scholar prefers the terminology Zoe as opposed to Chin or Cookie or Mizo or even Zomi. This is not a question about nomenclature, but it is a question about substantive. What is the core within you from which you engage the other? What constitutes the center of your being with which you engage the other, or you engage other traditions? This is why I made a reference about the importance of acknowledging and even seeking to understand the influence and role of the other in shaping our own identities in my introduction. Besides the obvious kinship affinities and familial ties of blood that Zoes share, the Chin, Kuki, Mizo, Zomi family also share a history of colonial intervention and mission influence, which pervaded each of our respective village worlds, almost in a total sense. For traditions such as those of the Zoes that have been oral as far as we can remember, that is what is often put in the phrase, that is since time immemorial, the employment of literacy or the act of writing as a means to validate our own self-understandings and agency is made complicated by the period and manner in which the practice of reading and writing was introduced. By this, I mean the introduction of literacy around the beginning of the 20th century meant that the Zoe world was, by then, mapped out and represented by sources that were external to our own traditions. And that literacy was introduced through the medium of mission schools, which was established by the missionaries, also meant that the new narratives that these education or educational institutions promoted were ill-equipped to engage these external colonial representations. On the one hand, the colonial accounts, which both preceded and paralleled the division of the Zoe territories into various colonial administrative centers, often assumed that these respective areas were unconnected worlds, and its inhabitants were categorized under different nomenclatures, such as Chin, Kuki, Lusai, etc. This is why we have the nomenclature and nomenclature debate in our study of Zoe. The official application of these designations for reaffirming their territorial fragmentation, which resulted in the administrative rule under the British government of Burma, Assam, and Bengal, respectively, sowed the seeds for the politicization of the Zhou-inhabited areas of Northwest Burma and Northeast India. On the other hand, the missionary education that we have received, which in the beginning prioritized an otherworldly discourse of salvation and focused at least preliminary in the basics of reading and writing, was both uninterested and unable to attend to these issues of misrepresentations by the colonial accounts. The official manner in which the colonial accounts were utilized and reinforced, and the confessional manner in which the missional accounts were immediately appropriated by us, bestowed a form of textual authority on us that had to be necessarily taken into consideration by these traditions in our transition from an oral to a writing culture. So these traditions not only found their worlds reimagined and retold from an external lens, but also found themselves having to negotiate their own self-understandings in light of these imposed lenses, because these external representations were already validated in the way our oral traditions are not. So the very act of writing for the Zhou therefore had the twofold task of, firstly, learning to internalize and engage the accounts written about us, and secondly, of learning to critically evaluate such accounts in light of their own oral narrative and lived practices. And I think it is at this moment or phase of critical re-evaluation of what is written about us that we often come up short as scholars, especially in terms of methodology. While the missional accounts arising out of Bible colleges and seminaries largely continue the confessional form of scholarship and often sidelined the complexity of the Zhou traditions in their attempt to develop a unhistorical or ahistorical theological perspective, the form of scholarship arising out of secular universities present a comparatively more critical that sought to challenge the way these traditions have been represented. However, even in these secular universities, the post-independence and post-partisan discourses, which were influenced in part by post-colonial and now subaltern discourses of power, tend to develop a very revisionist perspective of Zhou history, where the idea of an exclusive history is exploited to fuse scholarship and often political agendas together. These implicit motivations and what I call ideology-centric scholarship that it engendered or gave rise to have contributed very largely to the tribalization of Zhou history and identity, and have resulted in the construction of contradictory and competing narratives that have indirectly served to contest the idea of Zhou oneness by focusing too much on the particularities of their political challenges very exclusively. Both these forms of scholarship, the confessional form of scholarship from seminaries and the critical but not critical enough scholarship from secular universities, were ultimately unable to capture the sense of an undivided wholeness and shared praxis that tie the Zhou village worlds together, and were unable to excavate the more primordial spirit of oneness or being that characterize our Zhou-ness or Zhouhood and its world. So in a sense, we all have the responsibility of knowing both how we have been represented and what inform these representations. And when we say what inform these representations, we are talking about the underlying thought or thinking that inform these particular positions. For example, it is not enough to point out that what informed the colonial writing was their colonial interest of expansion. We must interrogate the philosophy or foundations of what gave rise to even their colonial outlook. Why did they have such a colonial and expansionist outlook in the first place? What theories governed their outlook and worldview to go out into the world and expand their empire? And so that is the form of interrogation and methodological engagement that we are talking about. For the Zhous, scholarship and even education is therefore both by default and intrinsically an endeavor of negotiation. It is a contestation, a reconstruction, a reimagining. While we may be very certain about our identity in our everyday lived world and in our use of language, in the world of discourse, we need to follow up such assertions and claims with validations and justifications. So it is not possible to just say, you don't need to justify yourself to anyone. I don't need to justify my Paite studies, my Mizo studies to anyone, as long as I'm talking within my group. The moment we do that is the moment we step away from academia and often go into the everyday conversations about opinions and sometimes even chatter. So to be a Zo scholar is therefore to be necessarily dialogic or comparative. And this has two important conceptual or methodological implications that I want to highlight. For example, if we are a student of philosophy, our responsibility, let's say I am a student of philosophy or working on Heidegger, or like Umura, for example, working on Foucault. We have the responsibility of becoming a Heideggerian or a Foucauldian first and foremost. This is important because we want people to take our work on Zo seriously. And so we have to be able to engage people on their own terms. And so in a sense, the responsibility of writing and of being a student is first, wherever we are placed in any discipline, to be a master or an authority of that discipline. And then secondly, we have the responsibility of engaging, in our example, Heidegger's position or Foucault's position reflexively in light of our own location as Zo, to try and engage his work contextually and see if there is a language that we can appropriate that is authentically ours, to see if Heidegger can give us a new way of talking about our own identities, or if there is a new way of talking about what it means to be a Heideggerian from our own position that informs the discourse on Heidegger, for example. So in a way, the path to our own authenticity comes through the other. And for us, the other in our discussion of scholarship is, for example, the social sciences, the disciplines in which we are placed. So our zoneness is not a given that we articulate or describe, but it is a negotiation that we hope to understand and unravel continuously in newer ways. So the responsibility of writing is increased depending upon the marginality of your location. So the more peripheral you are, the more the responsibility to outstudy and outwrite everyone else that is doing scholarship. And this is a practice that our pioneers, scholars, and educated people knew well. And even today, many of them know well. But it is something that we can practice almost as a culture. And the question we want to ask ourselves whenever we are thinking about writing from our own location is basically, very simply put, this question: which tradition of thought is informing my thinking, my being, my acting, and my writing? Which tradition of thought is informing my thinking, my being, my acting, and most importantly, my writing? If we look at, to move away from scholarship and into some of the choices that we make in our careers and in our day-to-day activities, if we look at some of the decisions we make, the tradition of thought that is informing us often is a very secular tradition, a career-oriented tradition, for example, rather than an understanding or scholastic tradition. And so in a sense, for us, the fundamental question that we want to ask ourselves is, what is the tradition of thought that is informing the way I write? And this form of dialogic thinking and writing enables us to move away from purely area-specific interest and isolated scholarship, and allows us to approach Zo as a tradition whose self-inquiry is able to offer insights that are relevant to the social scientific study of identities, cultures, oralities, etc. And to come towards our conclusion, I want to quickly talk about 3 orders of discourse and forms of reasoning, which I hope will help us shift from the notion of a Zo discourse to the importance of thinking about Zo studies. By 3 orders of discourse, I basically mean the first order of discourse is usually comprised of the tradition itself. In our case, the Zo tradition. And this tradition encompasses all the complexities and richness of the Zo world. These discourses is basically comprised of primary articulations whose texts are more or less the practices of repetition and rituals that exist outside the academic enterprise. So in our first order of discourse, we are basically talking about the practices of repetition or rituals that we practice as Zos. Those are the texts that we want to study and understand. The second order of discourse is a reflection on this tradition or the reflection of the tradition upon itself. It is what I would like to call the theology of traditions. Here, theology is used in the broad sense of encompassing the richness of the Zo outlook and perspective. Here, many passionate arguments are developed with the goal of clarifying the foundational values, morals, and perspectives that govern our way of thinking, our beliefs, and our practices. So this is the second order of discourse. And the third order of discourse is something that we already are familiar with. It is the form of reasoning that comes when we reason about the first and second order of discourse. Or to put it simply, it is the social scientific study of the Zo tradition. And so to conclude, in my limited understanding, one of the challenges that I feel Zo discourse consistently face today is the attempt to write a third order discourse, a social scientific discourse, without developing a culture of second order inquiry or discourses. And so while our disciplinary exposure is continually increasing, and we are introduced to perspectives, methods, concepts, and terminologies that guide us to articulate who we are often forced to work out a second order discourse and rely on insights that have not been introduced to the rigor and standard that is required from scholarship or social scientific studies. This is what I believe Zo studies could serve. So in my understanding, Zo studies is not a third order discourse, but Zo studies would serve as a second order discourse where it can be an arena or a platform that allows the self-articulation of the Zos to reflect upon themselves in a critical and rigorous manner. We all have our village-based practices and traditions that we practice in each of our village worlds. But if we can have a Zo studies that collectively reflects on these practices under the same thematic of basically Zo, then we have some substantive with which we can engage third order discourses. So when someone comes with a third order discourse to try and study Zo culture, we tell them that Zo culture is already rich enough to be understood with its own rationalities. Zo culture or Zo tradition has its own rationality and ways of acting and being and thinking that is different, maybe even similar, but most often different from other cultures. And so if someone is trying to study us, rather than impose their disciplinary methodologies on us, they have to engage with our second order discourse of Zo studies. And so they have to have the responsibility of engaging comparatively. And so they cannot just study any Zo tradition or any aspect of the Zo tradition and say that this is this, in marriage, this is this, kinship relations, this is this. They cannot just simply describe us without engaging with the way Zos think, with the way we think, with the way we live, with the way we eat, for example. And so this is where I believe something like a Zo study could be very helpful in helping us engage more critically with our own traditions and also with the studies that come from external traditions, third order discourses. And even for us who are studying our own traditions, if we are able to negotiate these three orders of discourse in a way that is sensitive to the richness of our cultures, then maybe we can someday talk about the philosophy of the Zos. Someday maybe we can talk about the richness of our orality in the same way that other traditions talk about theirs. And so Zo studies can provide, in a sense, a meta discourse about the diverse Zo tradition. It can be comparative. It has to be comparative. Make contextual rather than universalizing claims, and hopefully offer theories, concepts, and understandings, not about ourselves, but about the whole idea of self, the whole idea of world, or even the idea of what it means to be a human. So to conclude, I would like to say it is our responsibility, or it is the responsibility of all of us, to continue the work that our predecessors have started, to offer correctives wherever necessary, of course, but to take their initiatives forward with the goal of making a significant contribution to the academia and the world at large in such a way that it can be identified as Zo in its insights, in its substance, in its style, and in its language. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sam Ngaite, for that thought-provoking lecture. There are a few questions already, so I think I will turn to the questions immediately, and then anybody who wants to ask questions can drop questions at the Q&A box below the Zoom panel. So you're welcome to ask questions at the Q&A box. Just drop it off. Let me just read, Sam, for you the first question, and then we can go along. I think there are 3-4 questions already. Let me just take them one by one. So the first question is, in the beginning, you have mentioned Chin, Zomi, Kuki, Mizo as the studied, I think it's of this, the subject matter, I think it meant to say, of the so-called Zo. My question is, what about Mar? Can you hear the questions?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Should I address the question?
Would you like to?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for the question, Stephen. I did mention Zo as a concept and as a nomenclature when I talked about Zo discourse especially, and in that I have mentioned initially what I mentioned was the categories that were described in colonial accounts as Chin, Kuki, and Lusai. And of course, Lusai is now changed to Mizo. And then there is a discourse about or a conversation about Zomi. But you're right, I have missed out mentioning Mar. But the point of talking about Zo as a concept rather than nomenclature in the beginning is precisely to say that all of this, in a sense, of all of these nomenclatures, which are maybe even now understood as a tribe identity, all of these identities that come under the Zo are included in it. And so, in a sense, if we were to extend your question, the question would not only be what about Mar, but what about Gangtes, what about Vipes, and so on and so forth. And so, forgive me for missing out Mar when I mentioned Chin, Kuki, Lusai, but my intention was really to only mention those terminologies that the British accounts have used to talk about the Zos, basically. But of course, it is, I presume it is understood that it includes everybody in that sense. And so thank you for reminding me of the need to be sensitive about that. Thanks, Stephen.
Okay, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Stefan, for that question. Let me read for you another question from Emmanuel Lalram and Kima, I think. Thank you for the brilliant talk, sir. The significance of the Zo perspective and Zo-oriented scholarship is undeniable to help establish the Zo identity and the Zo as the center of his own world. Is the achievement of this academic goal primarily a political challenge? I will use an example from another webinar to help make my point clear. For instance, the Sepoy Mutiny was only altered by Indian academia as the first war of Indian independence long after India gained independence. Can our perspectives gain legitimacy without academic weight backed up from the centers of power?
Okay, thanks for the question, Emmanuel, and also for giving an example about the point that you're trying to make. I think it's a very important question. is the achievement of this academic goal primarily a political challenge? That I think that is the essence of what you want to ask. And I think, in a sense, I did talk about the relationship between academia and politics, almost in a negative sense, by saying that we often have we often write with political agendas. I think I mentioned that, but your question is different from what what I was stating, and I think it's important to understand that when we talk about the importance of developing a ZO perspective or a ZO-oriented scholarship in academia, I think it is important to at least filter out the politics of it first. And in a sense, this also has to do with our understanding of the political. We can, of course, say that the very idea of academia, the very pursuit of academia can be a political goal. But I am talking more about pursuing academic for its own sake. My intention is to talk about the ZO tradition, learning from the ZO tradition, the richness of the ZO tradition, and developing a perspective that allows us to talk about these traditions in a way that is making use of our own rationalities, our own ways of thinking, that is, in a sense, more authentically ours rather than borrowing from different disciplines. So in that sense, what I was talking about is more academic and specifically academic oriented. But of course, if we were to put the question of can marginal scholarship make their voices heard and ask questions like that, then it becomes a question about power. It becomes a political question. And so in that sense, I think you're right in saying that the academic goal is maybe even intrinsically a political challenge. But even if it is, the method is not at all political. The method is all about scholarship. I don't know if you would agree with that, but maybe our panelists or even Umura can add to the answer.
Okay. Thank you, Sam. Let's go to the next question. There are a few more questions, so let's go to the next question, and maybe in the end, if it is necessary, maybe we can have a kind of a dialogue. So before we go ahead, let me just announce this one. Please share. We have uploaded the feedback link below here in the chat box. So please go into that, log into it, everybody, and at the end of this lecture, and please share your thoughts and your feedback on it. And this will be used to issue the e-certificate for all of you who are participating. So that is the housekeeping detail that I want to put it out. So let me read the next question. So this is by anonymous. It's come anonymously. So what do you think is the greatest challenge for a ZO writer? I think you have spoken a bit about it, but what is the greatest challenge for a ZO writer?
I think that question may be beyond my expertise and knowledge. I think there will be many professors who would be happy to answer this question. In the challenges that I was talking about, writing as a ZO, I was especially talking about the early ZO scholarship, and I talked about the challenges of resources, etc., and so on and so forth. But I think I would want to answer this question in a different way. Whenever we talk about the challenge as a ZO writer, for me, I'm thinking about finding ways in which we can write that is authentically ours. And again, that is a very general statement to make. But for example, whenever we sing in our local dialects, for example, and I was listening to quite a number of songs before this lecture, and whenever we listen to some of these songs, there is a very authentic way in which some of these songs are sung. In a way, we can say, this is ours. Even if it's a Christian song, this is sung in our style. No? And so in singing or in music, and this is something that I think especially the Mizos are really good at, where they're leading by example in terms of appropriating the ways of, or the technologies of doing something and making it their own. For example, if you look at the Mizo rap scene, for example, everybody is rapping in a format that is not theirs, but it is so, the way they sing and rap is so Mizo in a sense. No, so in a sense, for me, I think the greatest challenge for a Zo writer is the same. How do we find that way of writing where we can say that, this is ours? And to be honest, I have not come across any work so far where I'm taken aback and I just go sit and say, this is a Zo writer. And I think that is the challenge. And to list down what will make that possible, maybe this talk is one small example of listing one or two problems, but I think there will be so many other problems for us to engage if we want to write as a Zo writer. I don't know if that is helpful, but that was what I could think of.
Wow, quite an interesting, quite thought-provoking answer for even that kind of a question. So, like, let me read this next question that comes to the Q&A box from Mr. John Seldo. Dr. Samuel, what is your take on Zo as political identity along academic identity without disturbing the colonial accepted Chin Mizo, Kuki Mizo nomenclature? So Zo political identity along academic identity without disturbing the colonial accepted Chin Kuki Mizo nomenclature.
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, and Umur, maybe you can help with this. But what do you think John means by without disturbing the colonial accepted nomenclature?
I think because the colonial narrative has constructed what it meant to be Chen, what it meant to be Kuki and Mizo in a certain way, right? The narratives have constructed it in a certain way, right?
Oh, okay.
So I thought maybe he's asking, what is your take on Zo as a identity in itself, perhaps, in itself, political identity in itself, perhaps?
Okay. I think this is a good question for our speaker tomorrow to answer. And I hope you will send him the same question because Zo Nuna would be brilliant in answering this question. So don't miss out on his talk tomorrow. But just to try and attempt an answer, I think there are several things we have to keep in mind when we talk about the idea of Zo as a political identity, or Chin Kuki Mizo, or as a colonial, maybe Mizo, Chin Kuki Lusai as a colonially constructed nomenclatures. I think when we talk about Zo as a political identity, we have to be very careful about not using Zo as a way to form a uniform identity, in a sense. You know, we are all Zos, but we are all very different Zos in a way. And so there is a case for using some of these nomenclatures. Maybe we don't necessarily have to use Chin, Kuki, or Mizo, but for example, Mizo is a good example of you turning a colonial constructed nomenclature into something that is ours. From Lusai to Mizo is I would say it's a good move. So in a sense, there is no harm in using these nomenclatures if our allegiance, in a sense, maybe allegiance is not the right word, if we understand that we all belong to the Zo family. And so Zo can be that overarching, like I said, meta concept or even meta nomenclature for all of us which encompasses all of these other nomenclatures. And so in our quest for a uniform identity that will bring all of us together, we have to be very careful to make sure that we respect the differences of each of these now maybe even tried identities. No, so I think all over the world, if you look at it, the challenge is always the inability of the majority. And here we are talking population-wise. The challenge of the majority, the inability of the majority to encompass the aspirations of the minorities. No, and it is the same case in the Hindu debate, in the Hindu-Muslim debate. It is the same case in our Zoe debate. And so, in a sense, we must fight or strive to use Zoe as our primary identity marker, but we need not necessarily use Zoe as our tribal identities in each of our respective states, or if we are talking about initially in each of our respective village worlds. Because if we look at our history, every village will have different ways of being a Zoe in some sense. They are all connected, they are all Zoes, but they are all different Zoes in a sense. No? And that difference is something that we must absolutely protect, I feel.
Sam, if you allow, just a rejoinder to that important question, let me just take the privilege of being the host and just build on that, or maybe extend that point that you're saying a little bit, right?
Yes.
Hello. Yes. So you have spoken in your earlier in your lecture about, you know, even the tribalization of Zoe history and Zoe identity because of the many narratives that has come up, and the failure to capture what you call a more primordial essence of oneness of the Zoe world, right? So with all that you have said just now as an answer to that question, like, how does one be a Zoe both in writing and practice, who is not hegemonic, who is not imposing yet another universal paradigm? How can one be a Zoe both in writing and practice, who is charitable to differences, charitable to diversity, and yet at the same time not being so tribalized or balkanized to such an extent that you can no longer form cross-tribal, cross-cultural alliances among the Zoe traditions?
I think that question is a very interesting one, and it's not, if I may say, it's not a question that is specific to the Zoe tradition or the Zoe people. It's a philosophical tussle, if I may call it that, that has been going on. And actually, in a sense, we are now in a time where we can talk about differences. For example, there was a time when universalizing positions were accepted as truth. For example, during the Enlightenment, for example, if you stated something, it has to be, the standard is that it has to be the truth, for example. No, so in a sense, what I want to say is this question is not specific to us. And as a scholar, I think one of the best ways to engage this is to try and see the if not the academic roots or even the philosophical roots of where these debates are coming from. So in a way, most of our lived practices, even most of our politics today, be it politics in the world at large or even our regional politics, are influenced to some extent by the theories that are circulating around. This is a position that Alistair McIntyre, for example, makes, that we are actually informed by theories more than we want to admit. And so in a sense, for me, I think it is important to trace the philosophical roots of where these ideas are coming from. For example, if you look at philosophical giants like Mikhail Bakhtin, for example, he talks a lot about the importance. He says that even academic shouldn't be monolingual. It is something that is polyglossic. Everybody is speaking from everywhere, and no one is greater or lower than the other. Every voice counts. And he was the one who introduced, for example, when in literature they were talking about the plays and so on, he was the one who introduced the idea of the novel. No? The novel as an important category in literature. And so there are so many examples in academics that we can learn from. The hermeneutic tradition is one important tradition where they are moving now to the idea of respecting the other. Or we have Christian philosophers who are talking about the idea of the I and the thou. For example, the idea of or Ricoeur even talks about oneself as another. That even I, in trying to understand myself, I'm already engaging the other. The other is already constituting me. And so the reason I'm giving these examples is not necessarily to run away from the question that you're making, but to try and see how these giants are handling the tension between negotiating differences, respecting differences, while trying to have this universal commonality that they can all share. No, so the universality that we are talking about today is very different from the Enlightenment universality, where all the other voices are basically treated as illegal in some sense. No, so we can draw examples from how people are negotiating these tensions. For example, Richard Bernstein talks about Beyond Objectivism and Relativism, and this is a book that especially talks about this. And maybe, and he talks about the idea of dialogical communities. And maybe it is the right time now to maybe chase the idea of zoos as a dialogical community. And so in a sense, there are no straightforward answers to how we will handle our differences, because ultimately it will all come down to some of the even very minute decisions and choices that we make in our everyday lives here or wherever we are located. So it will come down to that. But of course, institutionally or even from the academics, there are always ways to blow a new wind that we hope will be able to influence at least the coming generation of the importance of this. No? Is that helpful?
Thank you. Yes. We can continue the conversations in the next seminar, right?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Topic for the next seminar, right? Okay, let me read out another question that comes to the Dropbox. Something which is again related to what we have discussed from K. Vanlal Neipuya, right? Firstly, thank you for your brilliant and informative talk. What is your opinion regarding identifying various Mizo-ethnic groups? I think here by Mizo, he means like the zone nomenclature, I think, into Mizo as one great tribe without demolishing their identities as a smaller tribes and clans. As we all know, some tribes are not willing to accept them as Mizo due to some political history and territorial issues. Being Mizo is not a must nor what really needed, said some people. What is your opinion in it? Could these issues be the results of the inhabitants of Mizoram or some inti-Mizo big, like, to accept them as true Mizo? It seems to be the biggest problem of our reunification. This is a more Mizoram specific question, but still you can extend it to the larger question, I think.
Maybe I should throw the question to the panelists, or maybe you, no? It might be better for one of you to address the question. Would that be better?
Why don't you comment in just one or two words? If
I
you
think
try, just try.
The comment I would like to make, first of all, these questions are very important because these are real questions that people are asking about their own identities, our own identities. No? So they are very important. We should treat them as seriously as possible. But in terms of, without going into the nitty-gritties of Mizo and Mizoram issues, at least I think whenever we use the term Mizo or even Zomi in Manipur,
yes,
I think we must, and then and then whenever we talk about the idea of Zo, I think there is a clarification that those who are using these terms have to use. For example, if you take Mizo literally, it simply means Zo people.
Yes.
Or people who are Zos. No, if we take it literally, we are all Mizos.
Yes.
There is no
yes.
problem. But can we take it literally? Is it used in a specific sense? I think that is the clarification that we must always make. For example, that is the same. The problem is those who use Zomi or Mizo often take it literally while meaning something else, while meaning
Yes,
while
yes.
talking about very regional issues. No, so I think that is a clarification that we always have to make. Otherwise, even when we are talking about the Zos, we are basically talking about Mizos or Zomis in that sense, when we talk about its literal translation. But to now use to now use Mizo or Zomi would be very contentious, because people don't feel like they belong to that particular usages in a particular state or within a particular group. So I think as long as we are clear with that, with those usages, there shouldn't be any problem talking about in English Zo people.
I think what I hear you say is basically, okay, as a literal meaning, Zo, Zomi, or Mizo, they might all mean more or less roughly the same things. They could mean the same things roughly, but we should not use it to connotate a very specific tribalistic, very narrow mindset. Like for Mizo, only Lusei speakers, for Zomi, only Paite speakers, or for Kuki, only Thado speakers. Something like that, right?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Let me read another question that comes in. Let me just read one question from the chat box that has come a long time back.
Okay.
Among the few available literatures on the history of the Zo people, which one among them will be the most reliable? Dr. Samuel casts seemingly doubt on the Zo history by Dr. Vumson Swantak. Citing the author's one-sided view, do we have other sources by Zo scholars and authors which are more reliable than the aforementioned book? This is the one asking the question is S.K. Lalmuana Vaipei.
Okay. Thank you, Lalmuana, for the question. The point that I was trying to make, again, in terms of resources, I think it would be best if, for example, people like Professor Lam Khan Piang would give you resources, because they are historians by training, no? And so there are many other examples, of course. But in terms of the question, I think it is important to clarify that when I was talking about Vumson's, I was actually talking about Vumson and T. Gauguin's Zomi history as good examples. But then again, the footnote that I mentioned is that these are written by non-academics. No, for example, Vumson is not an academic, and if you go through his books, some of the challenges that I felt while going through his books is the difficulty of tracing where he is deriving his sources from. Sometimes he will say that he is confirming from his friends. Sometimes he will say, this is a conversation we had, for example. And how do you trace the rigor of those examples? And so the only reason I mentioned Vumson is to talk about not him being a scholar that is one-sided. I think he is maybe the only scholar amongst very few who are trying to write a comprehensive history of all the Zos in Burma, in Mizoram, in Manipur, etc. He's maybe the only few who's writing that. So in that sense, his book is something that is still very, very valuable to us. But my only point is that we need to improve upon that by making it more academic, by writing more academic books. And I think this kind of books are something that many professors or even associate professors are already talking about. For example, I think in Manipur University, if you talk to people like Professor Pumkhan Pao, or if you talk to people like Professor Zhang Khomang, they are already talking about the need to write a comprehensive history of the zoos. No? So hopefully they will be able to write them very soon for all of us.
Fair enough. Let me just go on. There are a couple of questions that comes in. Let me read, this one question that has come from WhatsApp. Like you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, many think we have talked enough about the Zo identity in academia as such, but it often seems like the Zo identity talk has not reached the masses. How, in your opinion, can this topic be more elaborately discussed so as to engage the wider population?
I think the example I gave in the beginning of my talk was to suggest that the masses are already tired of it because they are already discussing in non-academic settings. No? So in a sense, I think especially with WhatsApp and with different groups in Facebook, etc., there are people who are already discussing the question of Zo in some detail. But I think in terms of trying to find new ways of reaching to the masses, I think the webinar that we are doing right now, that HATIM is hosting right now, is very important, where we are talking about Zo as an encompassing concept or nomenclature, where we can talk about each of our regional expressions or understandings or interpretations. No? So maybe having more seminars like this or webinars like this will be helpful. But in terms of, again, because your question is about filtering this to the masses, again, we have to be careful about making a distinction between academics and the masses, because I really don't consider myself as knowing more than the masses, no, in some sense. So I think if we can just play the role as academics of setting up platforms where people can talk, and sometimes in our culture, talking even seriously about topics are not always, or to put it another way, having seminars about such topic is not always really helpful when we want to filter it down to the masses. The masses respond, for example, when we talk to them in the tea hotels, for example, when we sit around our dining table, or when we sit around our fire and we talk about, I think there, whenever conversations about important issues start, I think we must take up the responsibility as academics of trying to push them to pursue further on their opinions. No? So everybody has opinions, of course, but all we can do now to make the public more aware is maybe try to find the buttons where we can push them to inquire more about the issue or the topic.
Thank you. Again, let me read out another anonymous question. Okay, Zo should be our primary identification. I agree on that. Do you think to be more united, we Zo people should have one official language with giving big respect to our own original dialects, I think he meant to say, and share one political regional boundary?
Well, again, most of these questions are not, or most of these issues are not issues that are unique to us. There are so many examples we can take from the example of the Italians, for example, etc., etc. But I think in terms of talking about having an official language, I don't have a position on that, but I do have an example that I want to talk about. For example, if you come to Manipur, or maybe you are from Manipur, or you have been to Manipur many times, or if you come to Lamka, for example, everybody is speaking in their own languages, and everybody can understand one another. And so the need for having a common language does not arise because everyone can understand one another. No, and this goes back even to the times when the missionaries came to Manipur, where in mission compound everybody was celebrating in their own tongues, and everybody felt like they were celebrating in a tongue that they all share. Also, maybe if there is a way to revive that. But again, if you're talking about official language in the very technical sense of having, because if we are talking officially, we can't say that the Zo peoples, our languages are all this. We can say that, but when we are going to interact with someone, we do need to choose a language. No, so that debate,
Professor Rindikin kain unmute thei lawati.
That debate in Manipur, for example, is asked about whether we should use English as an official language for all of the sister tribes, for example. No, and that is something that I think we can explore together. But like I said, I don't have a position on this, but I do think that exploring ideas about how each of our languages work in places like Manipur, for example, is something that we can research further on.
Okay. Let's go to the next question. This is from Anthony Lalsuan Moya. Do you think Zo should be considered as transcendental in the Kantian sense, a term that we should not contest and question, so that it serves as our starting point for a proper discourse, instead of going back to the genealogy of the term with the intent of deconstructing it? In short, can we use Zo as our axiom?
Maybe you will be more qualified to answer this question.
The one who's asking the question himself is a philosophy researcher, so perhaps he's the one who's most qualified to comment on it. Do you want to attempt it, or?
Well, I do want to make a point regarding the second line that you read out, where you said a term should not, Zo should be a term we should not contest and question, so that it serves as our starting point for a proper discourse. No, I think with regard to that, contesting a term and questioning it does not mean that we are not having a starting point. I think I want to make that clear. I think, in fact, the way traditions survive, be it the Christian tradition, the Hindu tradition, or even languages, the way they survive is through critique and through deconstructing, reconstructing, through that process of doing that. No, so in that sense, contesting Zo is fine. I don't have a problem with contesting Zo, because even in our contesting, we are talking about Zo. So even in our contesting, we are promoting it. No, and we are, and for many of us, I think we are contesting because we want to refine it in a way that is more contextually meaningful to us. And so, if we are talking about that kind of engaging, it is not a problem at all in terms of using Zo, whether as an axiom or whether as a transcendental category, like, for example, the concept of God. So in a sense, there is God, but then there are discussions about God. No, so in that sense, of course, Zo is a good term to help us think together amongst those lines. But we should never narrow the understanding of Zo to the extent that we are saying this is what Zo is, this is the genealogy, this is how it is. That is one interpretation, and we should allow other interpretations about Zo. But as long as we are talking, even in our disagreements, we are promoting it. So no problems in terms of using Zos.
So like using Zo as axiom or transcendental or a starting point need not entail that we could not question it. Maybe
Yes,
instead
yes,
the very opposite, right?
yes.
Okay, okay. I think, wait, are there any other questions that comes in? I couldn't see immediately any other question. Does Professor Rindiki want to ask something? Okay, wait, I think. Okay, there is one more question in the meanwhile from Samuel Malsom Kima. Let me read this out. My question is a bit from the perspective of literature. While re-establishing or rewriting her history, Celie, I think, from Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple, used the same weapon used by the white Americans, that is writing. This fictional African American lady used writing to undo what writing had done. With the Mizos, do you think writing could be one of the most powerful weapons to undo what the colonial writers had done for the Mizo identity/history?
I think this is a very important and interesting question. And I think I mentioned this briefly in my conversation as well, in my talk as well, where I said by the time we are writing, by the time writing is introduced to us, stories about us, or even stories about who we are, narratives about who we are, have already been written quite substantially. And these are accounts that are not only validated, but used as official accounts. No, so in a sense, whether we like it or not, we have to take up writing to try and reclaim the idea of who we are, the sense of who we are. So writing is a tool that even to some extent we take up as a political tool to talk about our own identities. And so in a sense, I would say writing is an important tool, but I will not go so far as to say that it is a weapon to undo what the colonial writers had done for the Mizo identity or for the Zo identity, etc. Because I think there is a tendency, and I've mentioned this, there is a tendency by scholars today influenced by maybe subaltern studies, influenced by maybe Nietzsche's counter-enlightenment, to say that everything that the colonial writers wrote about us is wrong. And we have to undo it, we have to rewrite. But many of these colonial accounts, first of all, they were influenced by the philosophical standpoints of their own time. They were writing in the best way they know how. Of course, they were reductionist representations, but many of them were accounts that were also true to a large extent. No? So I think whenever we are confronting reductionist texts, like the colonial accounts, for example, I think our position, as I've mentioned in the talks quite frequently, our position has to be either comparative or what I would like to call dialogical. Because there is something that we can take from colonial accounts, there is something that we can take from even the missionaries, as long as we are able to engage with them critically from our own standpoint. And I think what is most important, the reason I talked about Zo discourses, second order discourses, because if we are able to have a firm foundation about where we stand, then we will be able to, we will know how to engage these external accounts that are written about us. To know what to pick, what not to pick, what is right about us, what is not right about us. And so in a sense, once you take that posture of being dialogical or comparative, then your language of writing changes. You no longer use terms like undoing, or even you no longer use terms that ascribe to power, no, like powerful weapons. For example, you no longer demonize the colonial writers. And I think we have to be very careful about not doing what we think they did to us. No, they called us savages, so we have to give them back. We have to sever them from all our ties. I think whether we like it or not, we are connected. We have a colonial history that we share with them now. We have a mission history that we share with them now, regardless of how they saw us, as savages, as sinners, or whatever. No, so in that sense, our posture has to be much more sympathetic, because ultimately we are not, what we are interested in is not proving them wrong, but finding an understanding about who we are. And so I think we have to be very clear about that. We are not interested in saying that the colonial writers are wrong. We are interested in finding out who we are, basically. And so there is a difference when we take that approach.
Okay. Let me give this time to Professor Rindiki for either a question or a comment. I think she's waiting patiently. Professor Adik, can you hear us? Professor Adik, can you hear us? Okay, maybe there is some technical snack on our part. Sam, I couldn't see any other questions for the moment, so let me drop in my own again. Okay. So you have mentioned about in your genealogical survey of the existing past Zhou literature, right? Right, Zhou writings, at least writings done by Zhou scholars, right? And then you have spoken about how also there was a transition from a traditional, largely Zhou oral culture to a written culture via the colonial narratives and records. And you have remarked that there was a transformation, a certain transformation in the mode of our self-understanding when we go from oral culture to a written culture that via the colonial narrative. And then you have suggested two steps or ways of retrieving our Zhou standpoint or our Zhou mode of being or writing or whatever it is. So you said first internalize the narratives that is imposed from outside, and so that we can sort of critically question them and whatever. So what would for you, what would be some of the, are there any examples, contemporary examples of such Zhou narratives, irrespective of whatever discipline they are coming from? It could even be a novel. Have you come across any good examples of that kind of an authentically Zhou narrative that is also very honestly and boldly internalizing or at least admitting the external narratives that is imposed on us, so that they come up with some kind of a critical standpoint? Have you seen any contemporary examples of such writings?
Well, I can't think of too many examples to give, but for example, I know that this is something that Bianca, who studied in SOAS, tried to do. For example, to talk about
Dr. Wumson's daughter.
Yes, to talk about why we need to take this position of being able to engage both of these accounts. But when I read her thesis, I was also taken aback by the example she gave of her doing that, because she said when she was about to give the example of someone who's doing that, she said, I may be a good example of someone doing that because I am trained in SOAS. I have I have my upbringing in Europe, for example, etc. And she gave some examples. I think, and I wondered if that is the way we want to talk about engaging perspectives critically, because you don't necessarily have to personalize it to the extent that because what I am suggesting is not for anybody to be born in England, for example, to understand British sources. That is not how scholarship works. So, the
Yes.
rationale she gave, her point, I accept her point fully. I really enjoyed reading her position and the justification she gave for that. But the example she gave of how to do that is maybe something that has taken me aback, because I think that was drifting from the main point. But apart from Bianca, maybe of course there are several scholars who are also already engaging. Both, for example, I think I can't think of anyone immediately at the moment, but I have not come across many examples. Maybe you can suggest some examples that I can look into.
Okay, okay, okay. Probably that's a topic for further discussion or for the project. I want to give the time for questioning and comment for the two, Professor Adiki, one of our panelists, and the one who will lecture on the final day, final night. But I think there is some technical problem, so she hasn't come back yet. So is there anyone from the panelists or who wants to ask some final questions before we wind up? You can just unmute yourself and just ask the questions if you want. Sarzonuna, you want to ask or comment on the lecture? Sarzonun Moya from Xavier's College, our second lecturer for tomorrow.
All right, just a few remarks. That was, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay, that was a very
It's a
interesting.
little,
Okay, that was a very interesting talk, very enlightening, and as well as thought-provoking, especially while sort of interrogating the colonial concepts and categories. At the same time, uh, I, I I will also talk a bit about that part tomorrow, but I find it very interesting, and there are a lot of issues maybe which we can talk later face to face, and I would like to have more conversations with our speaker tonight. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you, Zonu. I look forward to your talk tomorrow.
Anybody else from the panel who wants to comment? I couldn't see any other questions coming for the moment. Sir Sankte, you want to comment? Principal sir, you want to comment or ask question or anything? I think probably it's not coming. The sound is not going to him. Sir Sankte, can you hear us? What about Miss Amy? Any questions?
Not at the moment, sir.
Okay,
Good.
okay, okay. Okay. So, Sam, before we wind up then, since I don't see any other questions, let me ask one question, one final question of my own. If others don't want to chime in. Now towards the, I think at some point you were saying that there was those scholars who, up till now, those scholars who are doing scholarly work on all kinds of topics, they seldom write as either social scientists or as those. To me, that was quite challenging, no? I mean, like, that was quite challenging. So, to our those scholars, in that sense, from that kind of a standpoint, they have two-pronged tasks, right? To go right at the very heart of their discipline and to go to the foundational axioms of their own disciplines, and while doing so and inhabiting that foundational axioms and re-questioning them, re-questioning those foundational axioms at one level, to keep that at one level, but at another level to also take with them this idea, this particular contextual Zoe world or Zoe standpoint with them. So how big is the challenge, and how far away from Zoe studies are we really?
Well, I don't know if I'm in the position to answer that. I don't know how far we are, but I do want to say with now the access to resources that we have, and with the kinds of scholarship that many of our students, many Zoe scholars are getting, the exposure that they are getting, the kind of mentorship that they are getting from professors all around the world, and some of the best professors in India, I think we shouldn't be too far off. But of course, in any endeavor, the path is always first understanding what you want to do, no? And so I think if we accept that that is our position, that we are not writing as social scientists or as Zoes, for example, if we are able to accept that, then maybe we start there. But of course, that is a claim that I'm making on my part, to which there could be many counterclaims. There may be scholars who are already doing that. At least to my knowledge, there are not many. And there are, of course, very brilliant scholars like P. Zoe Pachuao, for example, who's written many important books, who's getting good exposure and mentoring, etc. But we don't have many of those yet. No, so in that sense, I think with the kind of scholars that we have who are already leading by example, we shouldn't ideally be too far off. But again, it all depends on whether we see it as a problem, whether we see it as a concern that needs to be addressed or not.
Thank you. Okay, before we end, are there any final questions from anybody? I couldn't see anything coming up through Q&A or message. Then maybe probably let's take this time to call it a night. Thank you, Sam, Professor Sam Ngaite, Dr. Sam Ngaite, sorry, for this very, very enlightening, very challenging, actually, talk. And this is an existential challenge that you have placed before us, to be both authentically Zoe in our contextual location, but also to be masters of the trade in whatever discipline we place ourselves in, so that we have a voice that is also understood by the other, but also understood not just as any other voice, but a distinctive Zoe voice, right? So thank you so much for this lecture. I hope the conversation is only beginning. So in our future endeavor, through maybe, God willing, many more webinars and seminars, the theme will get more and more crystallized, and we will think through together this question. Thank you, Sam, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, let's call it a night. Before we call it a night, please do fill up the feedback link that we have placed on the chat group. Please do the feedback for tonight, the lectures, so that this will be the basis for your certificates and other things. So for your e-certificate, please do that. All of you who attend will be grateful. Thank you so much for joining. We start off with almost 200 audience, and we end up still at around 84 towards the end of the session. So, which is quite amazing. Thank you for all your attention. And let's meet again tomorrow. Tomorrow's lecture, as we said, will be done by Sarzo Nunmoya from St. Xavier's College. A very, very entertaining title. So please do join us again tomorrow and the day after tomorrow for Professor Rindi